Hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Moore, and I'd like to thank you for sitting in on today's presentation. I'm currently a doctoral student at the University of Liverpool, and I serve as the Director of Accreditation for the Council on Academic Accreditation in Audiology and Speech Language Pathology. I worked in the field of higher education accreditation for the last 15 years, both in roles at universities and accrediting agencies. Slide. Next slide, please. As such, I'd like to talk to you today about my research because I feel that there's some practical applications for higher education of quality assurance. Specifically, I'll be sharing highlights from a current study that I'm conducting in an effort to heighten the awareness and encourage dialogue about how higher education stakeholders, specifically accreditors, may do more to address social justice issues. I'll briefly provide an overview of my study, highlight a few key points about why this matters to you, review some key findings, and provide some suggestions on next steps at the end. Next steps. Next slide, please. Okay, just to start, I'll provide a few points about the study. In recent years, the focus in higher education has been on public good and the increased demand for accountability in specific domains of the university, including access, participation, affordability, debt, employability, social and economic impacts. Traditionally, quality assurance and accreditation frameworks have been seen as key stakeholders in ensuring the public's trust in higher education via various mechanisms, primarily aimed at public accountability. Furthermore, it's been shown that quality assurance and accreditation frameworks are also very influential in shaping the priorities of programs and universities for which they have oversight over. Using both qualitative and quantitative research methods, this study investigates how quality assurance and accreditation frameworks can facilitate and support notions of quality beyond accountability to include more socially relevant oversight by examining agencies within the United States and South Africa, specifically at how accrediting organizations are incorporating social justice elements into their oversight and what more can be done by agencies to address issues. I conducted interviews with 9 members of the U.S. quality assurance community, including representatives from institutional, programmatic, and accreditation membership organizations. And I conducted interviews with four members of the South African community. Please note that members from South Africa were interviewed so that I could gather lessons learned from their experiences, since the South African higher education community has been very deliberate in integrating social justice related issues into their national quality assurance framework, specifically around racial justice issues. In terms of collecting data, I also interviewed or surveyed approximately 300 members of the U.S. accreditation community, including senior agency staff and volunteers. Given the events of the past year, including the social unrest that has been prompted by calls for action in the higher education community to do more around social justice, it seems that this study is extremely timely and relevant to examine how accreditation can play a more influential part in assisting higher ed in tackling many of today's societal problems. One of the primary objectives of this research study is to produce a how-to framework for agencies on how they actually can do more. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Before we move on, I want to talk about two key terms. Do you mind going back to the quality slide, please? Thank you. Before we go forward, I'd like to just talk about two key terms today, quality and social justice. The first term, quality, as you can imagine, is a term that is highly, highly debatable. In some ways, it can be likened to the expression, quality is in the eye of the beholder or the stakeholder. In a 2015 article, Wells and her colleagues conducted an extensive literature review around various definitions of quality in higher education. They noted when discussing quality that there are a number of stakeholders that should be considered when thinking about what quality is. These include providers, students, employers in society, and the academic community itself. In thinking about quality, they found that it normally falls within four categories. People define quality as purposeful, meaning it can be mission related, quality as it relates to exceptionalism, which is related to distinction, transformative, which is related to affecting change, and accountable, which is related to accountability of stakeholders. In one way or another, we all probably are familiar with these categories. However, more recent conversations about quality involve the idea of moving beyond these categories, especially accountability, toward conversations and considerations of quality that include social justice, equity, social responsibility, and social relevance in terms of how we look at quality in the education community. Next slide, please. The next term I like to talk about is social justice. Similar to quality, social justice is a highly debatable term. It tends to conjure up various meanings and even feelings depending on one's perspective and stakeholder group. The origins of social justice are based on providing help to those that are less fortunate, including the sick and oppressed. The concept continues to be debated and evolve, and historical debates about the term and concept have involved economic goods, liberty, rights, etc. More modern debates about this terminology tend to invoke or political, economic, historical, and social connotations. As this slide demonstrates, social justice is used in the context of addressing issues dealing with fairness, inequality, income disparities, racism, human rights, civil rights, animal rights, healthcare, and the list continues. I'm sure it's not any surprise to you that when reading or discussing social justice, people are not always on the same page. Next slide. So for purposes of this study, I want to define what we're talking about when we talk about social justice. In this study, I use the definition of social justice coined by Wilson and Straddle, in which they define social justice as about understanding and interrogating how different individuals or groups are faring in comparison with others in a specific context, such as a university or more broadly in society. This often involves the consideration of distributional issues, both in terms of distribution of advantages and disadvantages. Next slide. And at this point, you're probably thinking, why does this matter to me? And I think it's really important for us just to take a second to talk about why this might matter to you, what this might have to do with your program and or your university. First, I think it might be helpful for you to see what changes, if any, accreditors might be contemplating as they think about how to integrate social justice into their actions and what this impact might have on your programs. Next, perhaps some of the insights gained from examining how accreditors might be thinking about social justice may be actually applicable to your own programs and universities as you all grapple with how to address various issues. And lastly, I'm hoping that hearing about how and what accreditors may or may not be doing should provide you with an opportunity for your programs and your universities to be more proactive versus perhaps being more in a reactive position as it relates to potential changes and expectations around quality. And it also might be in your best interest to begin thinking about how how you set your own priorities, as opposed to waiting for the accreditor to tell you what to do. Thank you. So now that we've talked about what the slide is about, what the presentation is about, what the study is about, and how this relates to you, I'd like to talk a little bit about the findings. So what I'll do is I'll highlight just a few key findings that I think might be of interest to you. As I noted before, interviews were conducted with members of the U.S. accreditation community, and a survey was fielded to over 300 people in this community, including senior agency staff and volunteers. Because of the timing and the context, I think it's important to mention that the interviews, were conducted at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, and the survey was fielded in the summer of 2020 following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the social unrest following a number of high-profile incidents, including the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Next slide. So here, I'll highlight just a couple of the themes that came out of the interviews. The interviews provided me with an opportunity to get an understanding of the relationship between the role of social justice and quality assurance. Overall, in discussions with participants, it became very clear that context is extremely important. The first theme is related to influences. There are several influencers that were noted that impact how an agency might determine how social justice plays a role within the agency and its assessments of quality. This slide highlights just a few of the influences which may vary from accreditor to accreditor. And I'll give you an example. In the profession of sports management, there may be very different influences that might impact how one sees the role of social justice. Those may be very different as compared to the healthcare professions. Each profession may have unique social justice issues impacting its students, the professionals, and the public. The accreditor's relationship also with regulatory bodies such as state licensure entities or the federal government play a role. Politics, leadership, organizational values, these all come into play when thinking about how social justice has a role to play in your organization. Which leads me also to talk about how and highlight how one of the things relates to the lack of clarity. No doubt this is affected by many of the influencers that I just mentioned. There seems to be a general lack of consistency and clarity when it comes to what we mean by social justice, its relationship to accreditation, and even the related terminology around social justice. For example, terms are often used interchangeably: diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion. And there's just a lack of clarity around priorities, what priorities accreditors might also want to address because of all of the different influences, as well lack of clarity around what we're talking about. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So this slide highlights a number of quotes from study participants, which kind of highlights the points I've already made about the lack of clarity around what we're talking about as it relates to social justice, terminology, and even the role of social justice in accreditation. As you can see here, one person indicated that there are various terms that are tenuously related to social justice. One person also acknowledged that accreditors are stymied because they aren't sure what we're talking about. In terms of the role in which accreditors play with social justice, these quotes kind of reflect the uncertainty. Also, there's a sentiment that accreditation and social justice do have a relationship and that more needs to be done. Next slide. So those are sort of the results from some of the interviews that were conducted. Now I'll move on to talk a little bit about some of the kind of findings of interest from the survey data. And I like to expand on that question around the role of social justice and accreditation. Despite the role of social justice not being clear, most study participants, whether they were interviewees or survey respondents, did note that there is a role for social justice to play in quality assurance and thinking about what quality means. In particular, 71% of participants said yes, and 29% responded no, they didn't know, when specifically asked about the role, if there was a role for social justice and quality assurance. The 29%, the 29% may be related to or might be explained by some of the things that I noted earlier. Additionally, the majority of participants, 82%, indicated it was important for social issues to be included when thinking about or considering quality assessment. Continuing to delve into the survey results, I also wanted to highlight what accreditors are actually doing. I asked them what activities they currently participate in or have as part of their operations. This particular slide gives you a snapshot of some of those current activities. Participants were asked specifically, how do you actualize social justice elements in the work that your agencies do? Almost all agencies, 81% of them indicated that they integrate some type of social justice into their external standards, policies, and procedures, followed by internal procedures. And these might be internal procedures that guide their governance of staff. Also, internal activities related to how they develop and provide professional development and in-service training for both staff and volunteers. These are all common elements or activities used by agencies to further social justice issues. Next slide, please. Just to dig a little bit deeper on the activities around standards, policies, and procedures, agencies noted that these expectations around standards, policies, and procedures usually were around the areas of diversity, inclusion, anti-discrimination, and issues related to access. Furthermore, respondents were also asked which social justice issues are being prioritized by their agencies. For the most part, the responses to this question mirrored the areas in which agencies already have policies. Again, diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, it was noted in the surveys that a lot of agencies are currently reviewing their standards. This may be in large part because of some of the events that happened in 2020. Next slide, please. As we all know, 2020 was lots of things happened in 2020. There was a collective call for action by many people in society as it related to higher education doing more around institutional racism. So one of the things that I did was include survey questions directly related to what agencies were doing in response to calls to address social justice issues in general, and specifically I asked what were agencies doing in response to calls to address institutional racism within their organizations, their professions, or among the institutions or universities they accredit. Approximately 50% of the respondents indicated yes, they had been asked to respond to social justice issues. It's important to note that it isn't clear if this ask was made before or after the pandemic, the social unrest, or the collective calls for action. As for the direct responses to institutional racism, creating task force or expanding committees or boards, in addition to publishing organizational statements, were at the top of the list for things that agencies did in direct response to calls to address institutional racism from their stakeholders or from the public. Next slide, please. So looking toward the future, I also asked participants what more they thought they could do to be more facilitative for the programs or the universities that they accredit. So here you see is a list of the things that they felt that they could do more of. One, or the top response or most popular response, was around sharing best practices, followed by providing even more training for staff and volunteers around specific issues related to the context of that particular accreditor. I'd also like to highlight that defining social justice was an activity that approximately half of the respondents said that they would be doing. Based on the lack of clarity around this term, it isn't surprising that agencies would be looking to define what they're talking about as they continue to review and update their standards. Next slide. So the impact of this study, what am I hoping this study does? It's my hope that when my work is finalized, there will be some practical application to the field for quality assurance and accreditations. The three impacts I hope and hope to make are: one, part of this research is to develop a how-to framework, which is still under development, for how agencies and organizations can do more. The purpose of the framework is to trigger ideas, promote awareness, and to facilitate discussions about how to achieve and address social justice issues. Next, I hope that the impact of this work is to acknowledge that there is a more active role for accrediting organizations to play in facilitating attention to social justice issues. And lastly, it is my hope that this research adds to the body of knowledge about accreditation and quality assurance in general. And again, what does this mean for you? So implications for programs and or universities. The findings suggest that accreditors are thinking more and more about how social justice issues um, impact their assessments of quality and their oversight and their ability to ensure quality in the programs and in the university that they accredit. As such, there are some implications for accredited programs. And I'll just highlight a few. This isn't an extensive list, but these are just a few you might want to think about. First, accredited programs in various fields may be subject to changes in accreditation standards and procedures, and perhaps the way standards were actually evaluated, which could result in changes for how site visits are conducted, how volunteers are trained, how staff are trained, a number of impacts. Examples of standard and procedures changes could be related to how self-studies are processed, how they're reviewed, the questions that accreditors are asking as a part of the self-evaluation and self-study process. Changes could relate to curriculum, how curriculum is constructed, how it's assessed, admissions standards. Typically, accreditors are very general in accreditation standards. Admission standards, however, changes could be underfoot. Student services, and perhaps even the composition of the decision-making boards as well as site visitor teams. These are all things that could be impacted as accreditors start to think and evaluate their accreditation standards, policies, and procedures. Next, due to accreditor shifts in expectations around procedures, this might also cause shifts in the expectations that students, parents, employers, and the public might have of you as a program or as a university. For example, if now your accreditor requires specific faculty development requirements, for example, including training on cultural competence, stakeholders may now expect a level of competence shown in interactions with students and the public that was not there before by faculty. Next, I'm sorry, can you go back one? Next, it's inevitable due to the nature of many of the social justice issues present in today's context and the context of your professions, that attention to these issues will lead to some very uncomfortable conversations, especially when you're discussing inequalities. So be prepared. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the implications, there are changes coming. And so at the end of this, I've provided for you a few things that may help you in terms of next steps and thinking about how your program or your university may want to think about incorporating more attention to social justice. And I call this a call to action. Um, and I'll just briefly go through the acronym here. A, acknowledging. It's very important for agencies, programs, and universities to really have conversations so that they acknowledge what that you want to be engaged with social issues within your context and determining what your role is in addressing these issues either internally or externally. C, collecting data. I cannot emphasize this point enough. Collecting data and getting stakeholder feedback is crucial for helping you and your organization determine what your role is, what the issues are, and thinking about how you're going to address these issues. Once you've collected and understood your data, then you need to start thinking about targeting an issue or issues. This again comes from having a solid understanding of the information in the data. Due to the complexities of issues, for example, like institutional racism, it's very it's very easy for programs and organizations to become overwhelmed and thinking about where they need to start. But by focusing on the data and targeting issues, you'll be able to have a good start. Next, I, identifying outcomes and implementing strategies. Having a targeted focus is necessary and it will help your program and or your organization to identify outcomes and then develop and implement relevant strategies. O. O is for ongoing assessment and evaluation. With any effort, especially those that require resources like time, people, money, it's important to ensure that you are conducting ongoing assessment and evaluation of your efforts in order to track progress, to determine if you're meeting those outcomes, and identify any areas for improvement. And lastly, N, noting challenges, failures, and successes. Lastly, many of the conversations and plans to develop your work that you will develop will be challenging, and it's worth noting and documenting the process in order to learn going forward, to share with others, to share with others about the work you're doing. The setbacks and failures will come inevitably. However, there will be successes, no matter how big or small. This is noteworthy. And one of the biggest things that we talked about before is sharing the best practices. Noting these challenges, failures, and success will be very important as you work with your colleagues and learn from your mistakes. This concludes my presentation. Next slide, please. So I thank you for your time today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or contact, just feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Heather, for inviting me to this QA session. So hopefully there'll be some questions that I can answer, and I have a plant in the audience just in case. Lana, am I saying that correctly? Okay. So I might be all yours today, Lana. I don't know if you have any questions for me.
Well, thank you. Oh, I just froze. Okay, I think I'm back on. I don't, Heather, I don't know why I'm the only one here. I love these topics. What is the deal? So thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate you putting this together. As I'm a department chair, and so anytime I hear quality assurance, I'm like, ooh, I got to go to that because this is how I'm going to keep my job. Right? The checks and balances behind the scenes in higher ed are getting more and more clear. And so when I listened to your presentation, I thought that's what this is about. So I appreciate it. I just had I took a few notes, and I love you said quality is in the eye of the beholder, because what I think is quality might be different than what a student thinks or even what my boss thinks. And so when we go through this process of trying to define, is this the quality that we want? I think that was a good place to start. But I also really liked when you said even defining social justice, that 71% of the people feel we need to spend time on defining what is that and what does that look like. So so if I was to sit down with my quality assurance, we have an HLC visit we're preparing for, of course. Is there, would I see a component on there for social justice? And if not, how do we go about having this conversation to help define it and get it to be a part of our argument?
So when you say, would you see a component, meaning would you see a standard from
A standard.
HOC
Hmm.
saying, talk about your social justice efforts? Probably not, just because no, not most of the creditors I talked to, HOC was included in the group. They're not defining, well, here's the caveat. Most of my research was conducted pre-George Floyd. I sent the survey out right in the summer, so everybody was kind of scrambling to figure out, oh, there are these, calls for, to address injustices in society. So everybody, I mean, my accrediting agency that I work for and a number of agencies were figuring out, oh my goodness, how are we responsive to this collective kind of eruption of consciousness where not only higher education, but all types of institutions within society have been called upon to say, hey, this is a real issue. We need to address this. Now, most agencies weren't coming out and saying, well, these are our social justice standards, and not even defining it in those terms. However, people were talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd. So it could be that you would see some of those aspects in the standards. I would also imagine now a lot of agencies have started to take a look at like, oh, okay, what are we doing? And so they've started putting some meat around those standards. Now, I'm not an expert in HLC, so I don't know specifically what their standards say. I would venture to say, though, that they have maybe defined a little bit more or are working on that. Again, each agency, one of the things that I talked about in the presentation was, you're right, quality is in the eye of the beholder. Social justice is also something that lacks a lot of clarity around. And for an agency to really start thinking about what that means for that agency, they have to take into account a lot of things, including their professions, if they're programmatic or specialized accreditors, their membership, what their goals are, and also respecting, again, the individual missions of institutions and programs. So, I mean, so let me give you this caveat. I am speaking as Kimberly Moore, the individual, the student, not as a representative of an accrediting agency. So don't take this as like, oh, if, an accrediting official said this. What I would say is when your institution or your program is thinking about how you want to incorporate attention to social justice in your initiatives or your curriculum, those things, you need to first define what you're talking about at a program level. Because remember, the point of accreditation is not to tell you what you should be doing, right? You tell your own story, right? And then it's up to you to tell a story that satisfies the accreditor that you're meeting their minimum standards. And again, HOC, other accreditors may have standards around equity, diversity, inclusion. You're not kept to that box, right? That's just the terms that are, and for lack of a better word, those are terms that everybody's using right now, DEI. But I mean, there are so many issues that could fall under the umbrella of social justice issues. And it's really up to your program to think about what your students' needs are, how you're trying to uphold your mission, and how you define what those are. And then again, how you tell your story to the accreditor.
Okay. That's great advice. So even just starting at that grassroots, and you also mentioned in your presentation having the stakeholders present.
Mhm.
Um, I live in Minneapolis, so I live 3 miles from where George Floyd died, and so our community is very much impacted by this. Our university. So I think if you asked us to define social justice and how it's impacting us, it's going to be unique because of where we're at.
Mhm. And
So
and it's about context, like, because we're in the context of the US right now, and we're in the context of the US right now, And race is a huge social justice issue for us in this country. But if we
Hmm.
were to take this conversation outside to another context, let's just say, I'm going to pick Denmark, right? Or Sweden or somewhere where race is not really an issue. That doesn't mean that those societies don't have social justice issues. Again, it's context specific, and there's not a universal definition of social justice. You need to figure out what that means for your program, what that means for your institution, and thinking about the things that influence it. And one of the things that influence your definition or how you choose to define it has to be the stakeholders, the people that you're trying to impact. One of the things that I didn't go into in the presentation, in terms of my kind of focus in looking at social justice, um, there's um, there's an academic, her name is Nancy Fraser, and she does a lot of work around social justice and social justice theory. Really kind of critical of being a nerd right here for a second, like critical race theory, critical thought theory, feminism, all that. And she talks about social justice kind of having three buckets. Like when you think about social justice, you should think about representation, recognition, and redistribution. Recognition is the acknowledgement that disparities exist, right? Because you can't get anywhere if there's no recognition of it, right? So then the redistribution piece is thinking about the access to resources, whatever those resources might be. It could be monetary resources, it could be social resources, a number of things. And then representation. The representation is having those people that are impacted, like by decisions, or might be, impacted by those disadvantages, a part of the decision making process. So she talks about those three things that kind of need to be considered when you're thinking about social justice. And again, that's her definition and how she's kind of thought about defining it. But again, there's not a box in which you have to check off to say you got it right, because there's no necessarily getting it right. It's like there's so much work to be done, right? I think the impact is if you're making progress,
I
which
think,
would be ongoing.
but I think you have a good point. I think our university did some things right, and but I'm not sure they had the representation at in on the discussions, because as we got back into school in the fall, because we've had face-to-face classes all along, um, as we got back into school in the fall, we thought we were doing things right. And then we had a group of minority students that came forward and said, here's some things that you can do better. And kind of met with the president and called attention to some. And I think that's why that makes a lot of sense to me, because maybe that was the missing component for us back in the fall, was not having the right people, the representation. We recognized there were things going on, but we were recognizing them from a single viewpoint. So yeah.
And I think but a lot of decision making around issues, not just social justice issues, especially in policy, right? Policymakers make policies and decisions all the time, and never really think to ask the people impacted by the policies what they think. It's always like, oh, this happened. Here's the application, implementation, and these things went wrong. It's an afterthought. But what I would encourage you to do, like, and I don't know if you're in charge of writing this self-study or thinking about this, you might want to check out some of Nancy Fraser's work around how she talks about social justice. And I think there's been a lot of work done using her framework in Australia with some of the indigenous populations there and trying to incorporate them into, I don't even want to say mainstream, but just being more inclusive with some of the issues that are going on there with some of the indigenous populations.
Kimberly, in your research, did you find are there any, within specialized accreditation, there are fields that may be more either already in line with a broader understanding of social justice or an incorporation of these concepts or these systemic changes to the organizations than other fields? I'm asking you, are there some fields that are more open to it or more advanced, and I mean that in quotes, than others? Like I think sport and sport management lends itself to this topic very easily, but I'm curious about other fields.
I think so. I think some of the specialized accreditors are around healthcare because the nature of the populations, like, so you'll see a lot of cultural competence, some of those things. Again, it's not necessarily, that's not the term people are using, social justice. So if you look at standards, it's not going to say these are our social justice standards. Social work does, because social justice is like one of the foundational parts of like the mission of social work. So healthcare in some ways, I would say, might lend itself more because of like health disparities and some of those things. That doesn't necessarily mean a lot of those things are actually reflected in their standards, though, in terms of like, it's almost like some of the accreditors within the healthcare field have cultural competence as, some of them have it as a competence or thing that should be included in the curriculum. Others make mention of that it should be important. What I would venture to say, because I actually do serve on a task force, a social issues task force for the Association of Specialized and Professional Accreditors, we just built out kind of a, a one page or a couple pages on how you do this if you're an accreditor, how you start conversations about addressing social issues. I also think for accreditors that have optional accreditation, it's also a bigger challenge, right? The challenge is really like, how do you have standards that are going to be followed? So optional accreditation presents some challenges. I would say the healthcare professions probably are more attuned to it because of COVID, or pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd, because of the fields. I would also venture to say some of the agencies that are more on the quality the quality assurance side of the spectrum. So if you had a spectrum of quality assurance just being basic compliance, you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this, like you met these minimum, versus the quality enhancement side of the spectrum, which is more about improvement. There is some leaning toward the quality assurance side being less like open to it, because there's not necessarily room for it in the standards, because it's, do you have this input? Do you have that input? Whereas the quality enhancement, because of the nature of the standards, it does allow in some ways a bit more dialogue about getting better, uh, about getting better.
Yeah, interesting. And we're on the more of the quality enhancement side, and we're not required, so it's difficult. But
Well, yeah,
yeah,
because that could be a challenge. Because,
yeah,
part of the challenge is there are a number of challenges with
yes,
going in a more socially conscious direction, right? In terms of oversight, right? One, it's what do the standards look like? How do you assess those, right? Um, what's the sanction? I hate to say sanction, but if you're out of non-compliance, what
yeah,
does that look like? What do you do? And quite frankly, and Heather, you can appreciate this, Perlita, you could probably appreciate this too. From an accreditation standpoint, accreditors are always thinking about like, am I going to get sued by a program or institution? I mean, I mean, that's a real thing, because if you
yes, we
say
have
this is
insurance
the,
for that. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, but it's a real, the challenging of the decision, because how are you making these decisions? Because, some of the social issues that we're talking about do lend themselves to subjectivity,
yeah,
right? And depending on who might be making the decision on things that are fuzzy, because who says diversity is enough? Like, if diversity is one of your standards, who says you have enough? Like,
right,
your diversity in Minnesota might look very different from the diversity in Georgia.
yes,
And again, that's the beauty, I think, of accreditation in
yeah,
some ways, because it allows you to tell your story. Tell me how this
right,
diversity meets your needs. Because
right,
again, your diversity might look different than what my diversity is. But when we're making assessments of that from the accreditor, we do have to be conscious that we got to respect the mission of the institutions and what their context is.
right, and maybe encourage them in particular directions, but yeah, it goes back to the mission always,
Mhm.
and the context, as you have been mentioning. Absolutely.
So, but and Lynn, I hope I answered your questions.
It is interesting to hear because I'm in the accreditation role, but to hear an administrative role, and kind of from an institutional point of view.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think Concordia, we're small enough that when it comes to accreditation, that even though I'm in a separate department, I'm still a big part of it for the university. Within my department, I have a orthotics and prosthetics, which is NCOPE accreditation, and I've been through that. And I'm trying to like rack my brain to even remember if they asked about diversity and cultural sensitivities. And I think they do. I think they do, because we do intensives, like on campus workshops every 3 months. And there is a piece in that to patient care where I think that
Mhm.
piece where cultural sensitivities and the ability to ask those questions and have those dialogues comes in. Is this student able to do that, in a
Mhm.
respectful way? So I think it did come through in that accreditation. And that was awful. That was my first accreditation visit. And I'm like, these people are just mean. So,
Not every
so
accreditor is like that.
no, I know. And since then, I mean, part of the process is appreciating the feedback, right? And growing and learning from it rather than feeling like I'm on the defense through the whole thing and I'm
Mhm.
the bad
Mhm.
person.
Mhm.
It was I don't know anything about orthotics and prosthetics, right? That's just not my wheelhouse, but yet it's in my department.
Now,
So I've learned a lot, but when the accreditation was asking tough questions, I learned that I needed an expert in my department to help me with that. And so what came out of it was very valuable, but the process itself was very demeaning. you
It
know,
is, yeah. I mean, it
not good
can
to hear.
be, yeah, the accreditation process can be grueling. I mean, I would, if I sat up here and said something differently, I would be lying. And I try not to lie.
well,
Um,
our HLC one went just great, and now we have. I mean, and then we got nursing too, and the nursing has been kind of hot and cold, but I think because I've been in higher ed 10 years, but before that, I was in the industry for 20 years and I didn't even know what accreditation was
and most people don't until
until you get in higher
accreditation
ed.
is something you experience. It's not really something you go out and proactively say, "Oh, I want to wake up and do accreditation." It's like you've either been a part of it through, being faculty or being asked to be a subject matter expert. And the reality is that, you're going to have every accrediting agency, right, whether it be institutional or programmatic, they all have their own kind of own culture, right? Some agencies are more facilitative and it does feel more collegial. And then Heather and I were just talking about that spectrum, right, of quality assurance versus enhancement. Then you have some agencies that are very compliance oriented, where it might feel like an audit. um, and it should be a learning process. The intention it is supposed to be quality assurance. You're supposed to be a better institution or program because of it. Unfortunately, it can be painful sometimes. Like I wish that it couldn't. Um, a lot of it comes down to the preparation of the institution, preparation of the program, uh,
And the
a-
reviewers
and the
too.
reviewers too. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many dynamics that could go into, like, you could, I mean, the same accreditor could visit 5 programs, and every one of those 5 programs could say they had a different experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're being held to different standards. It just is the people dynamic of it, right? Because the site visitors come out and it's how people interact. Some people are just people.
Yeah.
Some people are, I'm here, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want any, like, give me the answer. Um, so I think that's natural, but I'm glad to hear that you did learn something from it. But just kind of going back to the social justice
Yeah.
conversation, I think it's going to be very important for your institution, for your program, to really kind of identify the issues that you want to target. Because I think so many times what happens, and I heard it in my research, is when you ask about priorities, right? What are social justice priorities for your agency? Everybody was kind of fuzzy about that. One of the things I think that George Floyd and a lot of the kind of incidents that happened last year with Breonna Taylor, all of those things, and even COVID, they highlighted some of the racial disparities in the country. So for a lot of people, that focused the priority for them to say, oh, we need to think about institutional racism and how that our standards or our policies and procedures are helping our programs to address these issues. It may not be institutional racism. That's just the thing that was in the news and that people felt very strongly about. It could be that you determine that your program, through the data, and that's another thing that I like to put a plug in, is use your data. Like, mine your data to see what your problems are. And maybe you already come with a problem, but use that data to kind of make the case for, okay, this is what we're going to focus on. And then from there, then I think you'll get an understanding of how you want to attack things, because anything that you do is going to involve resources. And somebody said this to me years ago. Your budget, no matter what you say your priorities are, your budgets always speak to what your priorities are. You can say our priority is X, Y, and Z, like, oh, it's this, that. But when we look at your budget to see where resources are allocated, that speaks to your real priorities.
I think also beyond the standards or principles or whatever they're called, the structure of the organization. And again, like who's at the table and who's actually creating the standards, upholding the standards, making decisions about the standards, and then making decisions about what the culture of the organization is and how it's presenting itself, but is operating in reality. To me, that's as essential or more essential. I am curious about kind of a similar situation. When I asked about different areas, occupations maybe, and their specialized accreditors, who is maybe a little more knowledgeable about social justice issues. I also wonder about just the makeup of the organization behind the standards, and not just say in reaction or response to a critical time, which I think is, at least, it's okay that happens that way, but who's from the beginning or like from the outset, how are these structures adjusting and changing behind the scenes of the principles or the standards?
So I didn't really dig too much, Heather, into the composition of the agencies, other than if they were institutional, programmatic. I mean, in doing some of the interviews, I have an awareness of the makeup of the agencies. I know that, again, and a lot of the accreditors, at least for the professional organizations, their decision-making bodies are made up from people from the professions.
Right.
Right. So that does influence, but you're absolutely right. Part of what I am hoping to kind of solidify with this research is also kind of a framework in how agencies or organizations, like we can go broader, can actually start to think about how they want to do the work. Because it's one thing to say this is what people are doing, but people want to know, like, how do I do this? And so part of it is looking internally, right? Your strategies for addressing, I don't know, whatever priority. It may be gender representation in sports management. I'm just picking something. I don't.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. Part of your strategy might be to say, well, let me look at like our internal operations, our internal representation in our agency.
Yes.
Right. Do we have, representation? Are we walking the talk that we want our programs or our institutions to do? Right. We're asking them to diversify faculty, to diversify their student bodies. Yes. But we have a commission that looks nothing like the field in which we're accrediting, or we're sending site visitors out to programs or to institutions, and these site visitors look all the same, have had similar experiences, and we're asking them to make judgments on whether this diversity is appropriate for this program or institution. So I mean, that is part of it too. It's
Yeah.
again, but identifying how you're going to
Right.
tackle it. One of the things, Heather, was, I did have some focus groups about this framework I was developing. And one of the suggestions I got was to develop like an internal one just for
Yeah.
how agencies work, and then the external one for in terms of how like agencies will operationalize things for institutions and for programs. So your point is a very valid one that I'm very aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe not even on some people's minds, not understanding that it's there are so many layers to this, and so much um, that is important to understand about perception. Um, and you don't do something because you want to be perceived a certain way only. It's because there's substance behind it as well. But who the people are and what they look like is important. For
And
a
it
lot of
goes to
reasons.
that representation. It goes to the
Yeah.
representation, right?
Yes.
Especially when it comes to decisions.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So if in thinking about accreditation, the decision makers, right? If you want these decision makers to consider quality outside of what we're talking about now, right? The Department of Education framework, the TIA frameworks that we have, you're going to have to start incorporating some of those individuals that have background and experiences in some of these things outside of what our traditional notions of quality are. And a lot of those notions are kind of based in the checklist items that the department has for us as it relates to gatekeeping functions, not so much for the programmatics, but at the institutional level, most of the recognition criteria is related to, do you ask them about this? Do you ask them about that? And for the social issues that we're asking, or at least I was investigating, this is uncharted territory for people. It's fuzzy. It's not a checkbox. It's controversial. We already know in the US, if you say social justice, people already have all of these notions of what you mean. I think I shared this with Heather. So when I started my research, I would ask people, just general questions. And I had at least one or two people start talking to me about race. Now, I kept the definition of social justice very broad, but we just have these connotations that we automatically associate with things. So I had to come back to the definition, but it kept going back to that. And that's fine that it's because that is one. But in the US, I think that term is tied to, it has historical connotations. Um, people get feelings about it, like it conjures up something, and sometimes people are uncomfortable talking about issues related to social justice. So if that's the case, now think about like, add the anxiety that you talked about, Lana, with that terrible accreditation visit you had. Now add another like point that people could get anxious about. So this isn't easy work that I would be proposing. Heather, and you and I talked about kind of some internal things that it's not easy. They're not going to be easy conversations. People are going to feel uncomfortable. But one of the things that I learned a long time ago, and somebody told me, growth is uncomfortable. It's like growing pains, right? When you're a teenager, kids have growing pains. It's uncomfortable, but that's where the growth happens. You have to kind of get outside of your comfort zone. And there's no right answer. And then there's not a finality to this. Like, oh, we get to this point and we're good. These things will always be evolving, right? It's like, because compliance, right? You want it to be, I check the box.
Right.
You'll never check the box on a lot of these issues. It's going to be ongoing, because if it's gender representation today, institutional racism tomorrow, it'll be disability, it'll be something, because disadvantages and advantages are always going to exist. And the way I define social justice is trying to figure out ways to like understand those disadvantages and work to mitigate them.
Right. The equity part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So great. I love talking to you. I think I learned that I also, when, you brought me back to understanding, I need to understand what that context of what is social justice, this phrase, what does it mean to me? And then what does it mean historically in this context and others? And, yeah, I made a lot of assumptions about what social justice was.
But I think most people, we all do.
Yeah,
we
yeah.
all do.
But I appreciate you pointing that out, because I was not examining that. I was responding. And so that's very helpful.
And that was one of the things about the research. Everybody like kind of said all these different things about like what they thought it was. Or when I asked them, does your agency have a definition? Some people said no, but it's implied. And they start talking about all of these things. And even just, again, doing the preliminary research and writing my literature review, there's so many schools of thought where it feels familiar. You're like, yeah, that feels right. But again, it comes back down to context, what fits for you, and how you want to tell your story, and specifically the Atlanta, how you guys are going to articulate what you want the world, right? Or your audience there in Minnesota to know about Concordia, to know about your program, and especially when you're talking to accreditors, like they tell you, give us your story, right? It's a self-study. If I remember correctly, HLC does themes, right? You can pick themes to write about. So I mean, it's not supposed to be a creative writing exercise. I mean,
At least in fact, yeah.
at least, yeah, but
With data.
yeah, with data.
I think
Thank you.
Yeah, go. Sorry, Lana. Oh,
I was just saying thank you to Kimberly. I think that's great. I know that we came back to the fall semester with our faculty workshop, and they talked about social justice, and they tried to do this whole theme around it. And I got back to my office and I'm like, oh my gosh, right? Because I have this, I think I have 8 full-time faculty, and I thought, what is my one takeaway? And I actually wrote it down and I put it on a little thing above my desk, so I'll look at it every day. Just that our goal as faculty is to help remove barriers. I mean, that was my one takeaway. I thought, what can I do? I'm just this one small person in this big, we've got a lot going on in Minneapolis, right? So what can I do? And I thought, if I can just get the 8 of us, the key team members in our department, to recognize when there is a barrier, that we can help remove it. And that's kind of been our I guess our internal push in our kinesiology department is what is that barrier? And I think in the past we're so often, well, I'm the professor, right? There's kind of a disconnect, and we don't take the time to figure out what is it that's the barrier for the student, and maybe that's part of this. So I don't know. So
yeah,
anyway,
it could be. It's how you define it, right? You figure out what your issue is going to be, your strategy for impacting that, and then you work in higher ed, so there's always an assessment piece, right? So you figure out a goal, you want an outcome, and then of course you got to assess it, right? And then evaluate it, and then revise. So I think what you said sounds fine to me. I don't know enough about your context, but it's starting small too. Don't overwhelm yourself, right? Because like I said, there's no end to this work, and there's no prize for doing getting there faster or whatever. So just take it one chunk at a time. And especially if this is new for everybody, thinking with these different kind of with looking at things with new lenses. And that's how you have to realize is it's going to take work and patience.